All right. It's a huge burden to be at the end, so maybe I'll just destroy everything. But I don't know, sort of a saboteur in wolf's clothing or something. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this. To think and talk among friends. So I hope that my comments are taken in that spirit. Especially because I do not know any way of doing political theory without a kind of attachment or the promise of a community, whether one that has been or one that is or one that may come. So, and this is especially relevant when it comes to Arendt, for whom, despite many years of really trying, I just do not feel an attachment to her. And because there's, despite so many shared concerns and loves and botherations about the world, there's just, I never hear her whisper to me or call me to redeem her or nudge me, and maybe that's a pathology I have in relationship to people I work on, but I've never felt the attachment of a certain kind of need or love. So I'm hoping that maybe, without becoming too therapeutic, today will be a relationship breakthrough, so thanks to you all. So I want to bring up three things with the hope that a mix of Arendt's attachments and repulsions can help us work through mine, as if they're important, and or yield some stances useful for thinking about our political and ethical present in relation to the demands made on us by human suffering. These are, one, the occluding quality of evil, however banal it may be, two, the aesthetic and political insufficiencies of centering on moral complicity and blindness, and finally, how Eichmann's not even uncanniness, Arendt uses a term that, the phrase that Eichmann is noch einmal unheimlich, that he's not which people translate as not even sinister, but there is a lot more through Freud that one can make of the uncanny, or the unheimlich, that can gesture to a presence for suffering and to a politics that befits it. So I think I share a lot of the anxiety about the more the specialness. So one, the banality, the emphasis on the banality of evil sort of sends me many mixed signals in our relationship, in our attention to her work, and also in what in her work turns out to be a kind of focus on the evildoer and evil deed, despite the proclamations of banality. It thwarts, for me, a possible politics of suffering that can only emerge from little cracks in the space these insistences take. It's almost as if the history we haven't quite understood keeps weighing us down. Arendt's take on the nature and expectations of Eichmann's trial in its commitment to the suffering of the Jewish people needs to be taken seriously to reveal the elements of a broader critique of the relationship between evil and suffering and the possibility of a wholesomely political and not merely moral relationship to it. The trial, on one hand, she says, builds on what Jews had suffered rather than what Eichmann had done. Two, and it focused on the tragedy of Jewry. It had a focus on the tragedy of Jewry, unlike, say, the Nuremberg trials that she says were not sensitive to the differences of, she uses really interesting language there. That there's something in these sort of dual motives that is quite radical about what in some ways the Israeli state was trying to do, to have a trial that's sort of focusing on, not on the doer, but the victims. But there's something confused about it, because in trying to go beyond the agent-centeredness of contemporary discourses of law and about suffering and wrongdoing, it still needed the agent to make this move, right? The idea that there couldn't have been this trial without Eichmann, there couldn't have been a way to talk about Jewish suffering without Eichmann's presence. So this version of tragedy validates and embellishes the wrongdoer, not the sufferer, affirming a kind of status to evil in its presumptuous sort of audacity to be able to vouch for suffering. Why? And that's something that really has stuck with me for a long time, that I quite don't know how to respond to people I feel I have a more organic sort of human relationship to, whether it's Arendt or Shklar, but there's something that I can't kind of cut through when they talk about vices or evil. So for Arendt, it isn't merely the spectacle or the fetishized presence of Adolf Eichmann that bothers her, right? It was also the aim to stage the huge panorama of Jewish suffering that wasn't, she says, in question, or had to be proven to anyone. It was undisputed. But why the need to sort of replay that in order to, in some ways, erect an edifice of Eichmann? And add to this the impulse to resize his presence to perhaps match the kinds of suffering that he was able to cause. And she finds this having deep implications for the narrative that would forge the Jewish state and its citizens, who had traveled way too far now to go down a wrong road. There's no part of me that can get drawn to the language of evil, and that's sort of the limit of my thought, which even when rendered unspectacular continues to render suffering recalcitrant, shapes it renders suffering reactive, and decisively deals with it in a kind of coping mechanism that I have wondered serves whom. I suspect it isn't the sufferer it serves, unless the tricky situation arises when we are either all guilty or all victims, and equally guilty and equally victims, distinctions that she very poignantly makes. And this is not a burden I carry in that form, so maybe this is, again, the limit of my thoughtfulness. However, thinking with her, I see how her distaste for pathos and the dramatic garrulity of suffering that seems to be sacralized, and this is part of her problem with the civil rights movement, or all of the certain kind of injury sort of galore, for her, I think stems from how easy this makes God or demon out of who causes it, right? Arendt then dismisses the drama of suffering at the same time as she dismisses the specialness or glory that this brings to the wrongdoer. In seeing how the trial conditions the public response to their suffering by making it more public and more palatable, there's a point where she says that it was easy for people to just say these things that they could never have heard people in a person-to-person conversation, that the publicness of the Holocaust and the suffering around it made it somehow just more palatable for everyone, which of course might have a role, but I think she's not someone, given her relationship to how I feel or I want her to have a connection to or worry about what's happening to the suffering there. I think she's worried about what that does. And I feel that how could she not dismiss this kind of sculpting and production of experience through this kind of framing of suffering in response to an evil that caused it, or a publicness of it. In any case, for me, this may signal to some room for a different normative claim regarding the presence of suffering, in the making of which I would readily join Arendt. In this regard, I can grasp her move to render Eichmann and or his actions banal in a sort of clearing of brush, not a proverbial new beginning, but a very deliberate and conscious negotiation of how this suffering will be insinuated in what kinds of foundations, for what kind of culture and existence. Certainly, much is at stake in what can be forced out of this suffering, choices made early on in terms of how the suffering ought to be indexed as a form of victimhood, needing Eichmann to call it real, seems to be a kind of commission or omission that could have not so great consequences in the life of the Jewish state and its people. Arendt's work thus needs to be taken beyond her to address what lies in the shadows of the edified banality of evil, to get to a form of suffering that isn't beholden, residual, or dwarfed next to the moral questions. 2. This is about the moral blindness issue, reflecting upon it, which is a charge that we were given today to reflect on that. With the exception of the famed passage in King Lear where this guy on the heat tells him to sort of see feelingly, right? A concern with blindness is far more determinative than invoking any number of other senses. So reflecting on blindness could entail, 1, wondering if there are unspoken imperatives to look in a given direction or to find something we're not seeing. Or 2, it brings up, by the emphasis on a kind of vision or its absence, the domain of aesthetic and sensuous experience beyond sight that gets determined through morality, and that, especially in relationship to the experience of suffering, might need to be attended to, and perhaps also detached, as like this, I like the very visual thing of it, just kind of prying it apart, detached from moral concerns and their certainties if necessary. What suffering does morality blind us to? And what is blinding about morality? Or still yet, how do we become blind to it or through it? And what possibilities of political reconstitutions and restitutions does it render peripheral or not an option? Arendt reminds us that the moral and the legal are separate. However, the complicity of the moral and the legal grants the state, and here I want to emphasize any state, its justifications, raising the question of how necessary a particular drama of suffering and victimhood is to a state, and where unharnessed suffering is much more threatening to it. This is where the coupling of moral suffering and evil, moral concerns with a right Hegelian flirtation with the state is perplexing to me. As if once suffering and evil have been desacralized, a sacrality has to be granted to the state, especially, which I feel that when she makes these ironic jabs at, oh, how hypocritical the Jewish state is, and, you know, all these things that, like, it's all these deep hypocrisies and its bad policies, I don't know if she's a political scientist. Like, did she read way? I mean, there's a certain way that I wonder why, unless the state was made willy-nilly into something other than a state and sacralized in some manner, why would we be asking the questions of a state that we should already know? So I feel that there's a certain kind of hint at a romance, even if it's full of a teasing romance, which is sort of like Arendt, right? Like, there's a lot about her that's like, you know, she would never quite completely come close to you. There's a, you know, she has this a strange dance, but so there's a certain way that so I feel alien to a mindset that, against all forms of confessed rejections, allows for the smuggled-in romance of the kinds of imperfections a state must have, rather than to have a structural claim that goes something like, what else is something born of certain circumstances going to be, right? What else? What sort of state what can any state ever be? Well, I'm not trying to be glib here, because I do feel that there's something specific about, especially in the writing of socialist Zionists, where the state is far less de-emphasized, far more de-emphasized in relationship to a different kind of connection to land. And I mean, there are enough Hegelian sort of Zionists who are not going to go that route, but I think there is something there to be gotten at, that there's something less than flirtation that is possible with the state, or certainly I hope so. But so a centering of the question of the state and politics in moral considerations, in my view, is a bit tricky, right? I feel it apologizes for the forms of hierarchies and privileges that the politics of our world has experienced for centuries, that have all in some way determined what suffering matters and what doesn't. If the forms of conversations we have serve the purpose of drowning the conversation, not of some ethical, existential, moral, speculative nature, but of a substantially political one, of who must account for suffering, it isn't hard to imagine how those powers and discourses historically responsible outside of the narrow structures of blame are those who become the saviors overnight. And even those who were the criminals are not begrudged when Europe stands righteous and strong, untainted in its power and its claims, with no crack in its armor, and the suffering residing in concrete rubbles can either be examined in the unreflective sentimentality of displaced victimhood. Again, something on the terms, I mean, this is really important, right? Like, I mean, in some ways, a very quick sort of left sort of Israeli response is, you know, we are replaying the victim, you know, we are now the perpetrators of something that happened to us. And what sort of gets missed in that is that there's something about that particular victimhood that's not entirely natural and unframed, and that, you know, mediating our relationship to another's suffering through you know, a collectively imposed injury and victimhood is not going to be a way out of anything at all. Like, it just wouldn't be, right? And so when we see our victimhood, or the way in which we are subjects of a suffering mediated by imperial powers and the state, then we can see that neither my nor your suffering has mattered or been honored on its own terms, right? So this just isn't going to be. So finally, I just want to sort of bring back the uncanny for a moment. So I want to take some of Arendt's distaste for pathos and bring it into the realm of finding a presence for suffering that might befit an aesthetic and political challenge to atrocity and injustice in the world today. How can the question of the blindness via evil, raised above, give way to an aesthetic reintroduction of the presence of suffering, making it present in a way that escapes the scripting of trials that last a few weeks or decades? In some ways, we are now suffering from the banality of evil. If evil must vouch for suffering, having made it to the banality of evil, might we move beyond and think of the ordinariness and ubiquity of suffering, something that can be rendered aesthetic and political material of a different kind? I feel that in finding Eichmann noch einmal unheimlich, Arendt leaves a clue about the kind of closeness and familiarity or of embrace knowing how she might have embraced, this could be, right? With Freud, I want to translate this as something that navigates both the familiar, the unfamiliar, and the hauntings that make one the other, right? There's a really weird space between the Heimlich and the Unheimlich. Her description of him is precisely not determinative or morally certain, right? I mean, one might think, unless you translate it as sinister, which it isn't, actually. So there's something not completely clear or certain about it, and neither is it simply irrelevant, in my view, to an emergent sense of material suffering. With its surface level, not even grotesqueness, there's something not altogether hard to find one's way in, which is another way people talk about the Unheimlich, is that you can't sort of find a way in. So I'm thinking there's more, in terms of psychoanalysis, that's happening here that's not limited to cruelty or subject positions. But and so infusing the suffering we know well with a presence all its own requires a kind of intimacy that is being wasted on Eichmann, something that makes it a little less familiar, a little less countable, and completely harnessed by the state and its machinery. Maybe the home in the Heimlich will bring up the refuge that a closeness and intimacy with suffering necessitates, not to be written to the state. Where the suffering must struggle with the possibility of not seeing, of losing one's love, maybe it will not let evil take all the space all the time. And I just feel that the problems we are trying to solve in the world will not respond to the tried and tested diagnoses of evil. So, thank you.